Buenos dias. I'm going to start. So thank you, Leslie, for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate your labor as program coordinator, but also you and Chris for this amazing theme for the conference, the idea of the will to reimagine. And when I heard the theme, the will to reimagine, it reminded me of one of Gloria Anzaldua's quotes, critical theorist, lesbian, writer, poet. She says, nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. And you all are creating the space to reimagine the study of higher ed. Thanks to the two of you for facilitating that space at this meeting. To get started, I do want to recognize, again, and honor the original and current peoples of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the community and Confederated Tribes of Siletz. We should also recognize the generations of local indigenous resistance that continues today. I'm on a campus, Cal State LA, that sits on Tongva land, and regularly at meetings, particularly those sponsored by our union, recognize, do an acknowledgement of the indigenous land that we're on. So I really appreciate that ASH has taken that on as something that they will be doing regularly. It's very important. I also want to acknowledge the presence of my ancestors and the strength of the four directions as I ask us all to kind of focus on reimagining the possibilities of higher ed. Today, in the short time that I have with you, I'd like to point to the power of reimagining epistemological boundaries and how doing so opens up possibilities for how we conduct research. There's clearly many ways to reimagine higher education and the study of higher education, but given my expertise, my comments draw from Chicana Latina feminist thought and a forthcoming article in Aslan, a journal of Chicano studies. So that's where I'll be pulling from today. I'll reflect on my own scholarly journey, but more importantly, on the feminista methodological interventions of other education scholars. And I argue that these methodological interventions are ruptures to the normative way of conducting research. My reflections are guided by two questions. The first question is, what does it mean to utilize a Chicana Latina feminist epistemology in research? And what are some of the methodological interventions that have emerged from feminista epistemological perspectives? To answer these questions, I'll share how I came to use a Chicana feminist epistemological perspective in my scholarship, and then I'll follow with a look at methodological interventions, highlighting specifically, I want to talk today a little bit about Pláticas and about Convivencia. I'll end with hope and confidence in the current and next generation of education scholars who are moving us forward to reimagine the study of higher education. So I will date myself. I was a graduate student in the early 90s, mid 90s at UCLA. And my dissertation research focused on Chicanas' participation and their leadership in the 1968 East Los Angeles walkouts. The walkouts, for those of you that aren't familiar, were, there was, depending on different accounts, 12 to 15,000 students who walked out of schools in protest of inferior educational conditions. Mostly LA Unified. It was led by Mexican-American students, but there were definitely African-American, white allies throughout the city that walked out. And my interest was in the women and their involvement. I conducted oral histories with these 8 women, but I didn't have an array of Chicana feminist methodologies to guide my empirical research as a graduate student. So I talked with these 8 women. These are pictures, obviously, with the year that they were involved in '68. I interviewed them in 1995, years later looking back. So since I didn't have that array of Chicana feminist methodologies at that time, I have to say that honestly, my methodological inspiration came from my grandmas and from the family storytelling I grew up with. And part of the reason that I was looking to do the oral histories and looking at women was because of the women in my family. And I knew that the women in my family had done things. I know we're half of the population, and I hadn't heard those stories, but growing up, I heard a lot of stories. And so that was part of that kind of methodological inspiration. I drew upon my experiential knowledge as a first-generation college student, from my work experience as an elementary school teacher and a community organizer, my cultural history and memory, and clearly indigenous and women of color feminist writings. However, I could not yet name all of that as part of my epistemological perspective, or what I later called intuition. In 1998, I published an article grounded in that early research titled Using a Chicana Feminist Epistemology in Educational Research, very much grounded in that study of the women from the 68 blowouts. In it, I outlined a conceptualization of cultural intuition and a Chicana feminist system of knowing that questioned whose knowledge and realities are accepted as the foundational base of knowledge, especially in the research process. I drew upon my early academic theoretical inspirations after my grandma's. I drew upon scholars such as Gloria Ansaldúa, Sherry Moraga, Mary Pardo, Emma Perez, Carla Trujillo, and many others. And they allowed me to think about the ways to privilege ways of knowing from the life and experiences of Chicanas. I argue that a Chicana feminist standpoint disrupts traditional epistemological boundaries and informs how we developed and enact the research process. From the very questions we ask and the analysis of our findings to the political and the ethical considerations also. My early, and I would say somewhat limited, articulation of a Chicana feminist epistemology gave me a way to name a system of knowing grounded in knowledge that arises from specific socio-political and cultural histories and is also linked to the idea of a borderland sensibility. It's a system of knowing that acknowledges liminal spaces, it embraces contradictions, tensions, and the messiness within our lives, but also the messiness that happens in our research, where everything doesn't always fit into a box, into a specific category or theme. Using a Chicana feminist epistemology in research challenges the Western notions of objectivity, neutrality, definitely the mind and body split, and embodies the goals of advocacy scholarship, linking research to real community concerns, to the attempts to transform. It's a step towards decolonizing the research process. All of this is important because the claim to an epistemological grounding is a crucial legitimizing force, both within academia and outside of academia. And I more fully realized the importance of this legitimizing force in 2009. I was at the Critical Race Studies in Education conference that year. It was held in Tucson. I think one of the days was at University of Arizona, but another day was at one of the local high schools. And three brilliant then graduate students, Lindsay Perez-Uber, Maria Malagon, and Veronica Velez, approached me and asked me if I had time to meet with them. They were using a Chicana feminist epistemology in their dissertation methodology. They were thinking of a cultural intuition. They had questions. Are they doing it right? Well, really, we think it should be this. And so I remember we went into a classroom, one of the high school classrooms, and we sat and we talked about their work and what they were doing. And what they did is they shared with me that really another generation of scholars were using, were talking about, were expanding, were extending my ideas from 1998 about cultural intuition and a Chicana feminist epistemology. So, in 2012, we published an article called Chicana Feminist Epistemology Revisited, Cultivating Ideas a Generation Later. I need to back up because the first author on that article is Dolores Calderon. She wasn't at the meeting, but she was an assistant professor at the time, and she actually is first author on that. And so she joined our discussion in kind of revisiting this, cultivating these ideas by another generation. We pointed to how a Chicana feminist epistemology is a deliberate search of mending a colonized body, complete, and how scholars had taken up the importance of place, of land, of sexuality, and of spirituality in shaping one's epistemological perspective, that all of those are also part of the mix, things that I really didn't highlight in the original article. This particular article includes a lit review, of many of the education scholars who at that time had already engaged a feminista epistemology in their research. Perhaps most importantly, we looked at the queering of a Chicana Latina feminist epistemology and explored how a new generation of scholars, such as Anita Tejerina Brevilla, were really redefining it by centering a queer episteme and disrupting the confines of heteronormativity. Anita and these scholars that were doing this work really remind us that while claiming a Chicana feminist perspective, we may still bring colonizing mechanisms into the research process. And so we always have to be aware of our role as insider, as outsider, as colonizer and colonized. So part of this work requires us to consider what those mechanisms are in an effort to continue to disrupt them. Adopting a Chicana Latina feminist epistemology and research is more than just adopting a theoretical lens, becoming familiar with the literature, learning corresponding methods, and analyzing data. It embodies who one is and requires us to grapple with our activist scholar role, embrace alternative ways of knowing, and confront those aspects of ourselves that render us the colonized and the colonizer. A Chicana Latina feminist perspective allows us to change the theoretical and methodological tools so they align with our worldviews that are shaped by place, relationships, brown bodies, sexuality, spirituality. So if you'll bear with me and let me do a little bit of professor mode. So I think of Chicana Latina feminist epistemology as the umbrella. And under that umbrella, what I think of is that it is a particular epistemological orientation that has allowed for certain kinds of theoretical or methodological tools to emerge from that. And so I am teaching right now, I teach a whole class on Chicana feminist theories, so in this very brief time, I just want to put some of those out there. And so ideas, cultural intuition as part of that umbrella, if you will. Borderlands, Gloria Ansaldúa offers us that notion of borderlands, and it becomes both used in some folks' methodology, but also as an analytical tool to analyze data, right? Pláticas, I'm going to talk more in just a little bit about Pláticas as method and as methodology. Nepantla, Ansaldúa in her later work really develops Nepantla. Nepantla is a Nahuatl word that means land in the middle. And so it's really pointing to the ideas of a liminal space, of that in-between space, of identities, of location, of ideas, and she really builds on it from Borderlands because within Nepantla she also brings pieces of spirituality. The brown body, women of color have talked for a very long time about the embodiment that we have in our bodies, our theory in the flesh, right? And so part of that is based in that. Spiritual activism is something that Gloria Ansaldúa also offers us, the idea that moving from our inner selves to the work that we do outer. And she talks about that specifically with, oh, I thought it was the next one, with conocimiento. Testimonials, both as, has been talked about both as a methodological tool, as a theoretical, and as an activist tool. Convivencia, I'll talk about in just a moment, as a methodology. Conocimiento is, the spiritual activism is part of Gloria Ansaldúa's idea of this path of conocimiento. Conocimiento meaning critical awareness or a critical consciousness, and that it's an ongoing path. And she talks about the different spaces of this, of which spiritual activism is one of them, but there's other places, including Nepantla, along that. Conocimiento is used by Nancy Acevedo Gil in some of her work in higher ed. And so I think it's real important to see these concepts as again, methodological tools. Today I'm not talking about as pedagogical tools, but some of them are also that. Decolonial Imaginary is offered to us by Emma Perez. And nosotras. Nosotras, real quick, is the idea, nosotras in Spanish is we. If you break it up, nos is us, otras is them. and the idea about bridging. How do we bring folks from very different perspectives, whether we're working in the university, where we're working in the K-12 system, with different ideas and perspectives, and what does that mean around bridging nosotras? Again, clearly, I do a whole class on this. I do one class on testimonios, so I can't give it all, but I think it's important to think of the umbrella under which concepts, theories, methodologies can emerge when we're reimagining something different. So scholars have indeed provided us with new methodological tools and categories to guide our empirical research. Despite this, I regularly receive emails from graduate students who are reaching out and have questions about using these kinds of tools, and graduate students who, thesis committee members, dissertation chairs, say you can't really use Chicana Latina feminist epistemology, or if you're doing feminist work, are you doing a comparative with European feminists? Or you really can't use Pláticas or testimonios as a methodology. You could do semi-structured interviews, narratives, and then make sure you cite the corresponding literature. I think the politics of citation is one means by which the apartheid of knowledge is maintained. And the scholarship and methodologies of indigenous scholars and scholars of color remain undervalued when that kind of example happens. This means we must be even more diligent and rigorous in how we employ and how we cite an array of feminista methodologies. So let me share some of those with you, because I think it's important to look at where that has come. I include Gonzalez's work, 1998, because it's very important in that even in 1998, she was already talking about trenzas y mestizaje as a type of methodological tool. Trenzas being braids, and the idea of braiding different qualitative methods together, mestizaje being mixed identities. She was working with high school students, and so she puts this as trying to name in 1998 in the field of education, not higher ed, but in education, trying to name this as her methodological orientation. Oppositional consciousness, Jela Sandoval, is not in education, but education scholars have employed her framework both in higher ed and in K-12 settings. Now, testimonials as methodology. Testimonials have been used in Latin America at least since the 1960s, 1970s, particularly under political regimes where people are trying to tell their story of political urgency. Many of us will argue that in 2001, Latina Feminist Group is when, do you see my PowerPoint? Oh, okay, it's back and forth. Okay, I was like, oh, I've been pointing all the time to the umbrella. I can see it right here. Many of us argue that the Latina Feminist Group in 2001 really began to redefine and shape testimonials as both method and as methodology. And then a number of us kind of write from that. But I think it is important to recognize that tradition in Latin America in 1960s and 70s as a way to put the word out. And so testimonials, we're not going to have Q&A afterwards, but one of the questions I always get is, what's the difference between, say, testimonial and a personal narrative or a life story? And there's a number of, I would say, characteristics of testimonial. And one of them is that it is a narrative of political urgency. It is an individual narrative, but it's a narrative that represents a group of people, and it is a narrative from the marginalized, subaltern, or some would say oppressed. And how that gets defined is very differently in different scholarship, but it is very different than a life history. And so when those students reach out to me and say, oh, they won't let me, my committee won't let me use a testimonial, it's important to cite the literature, because there is literature out there that says what it is and how it is different, and why you want to use it in a particular study. Does it fit? Does it make sense? Chicana feminist ethnography, Michelle Theas does work in really talking about doing ethnographies in a different way. and from a Chicana feminist perspective. How does that look differently as an insider, outsider, again, both the colonizer and the colonized? Chicana Participatory Action Research, another education scholar who's really looking at participatory action research par, but again, from a Chicana perspective and also bringing in spirituality into that practice in the research. Mujerista portraiture is very recent. This is Alma Flores. She's new faculty at Sac State. And she just published a couple years ago an article in the Journal of Chicana Latina Studies. And she uses Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's work in portraiture, her amazing work in portraiture. And then she pairs it with Chicana feminist perspectives and theories and does a beautiful job of kind of melding that. And her work is specifically with Chicana college students. Her work explores the practices between Mexicana, Chicana immigrant working class mothers and their first generation college students. Pláticas I'd like to talk about right now, as well as Convivencia in a little bit more detail. And Convivencia is Ruth Trinidad Galvan, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge Ruth passed away about 2 weeks ago. A brilliant, beautiful mind. She was at University of New Mexico for probably about 15 years, but a brilliant, beautiful mind taken way too soon, battle with cancer. So rest in peace and power, Ruth. So let me talk just a little bit about the contours of Pláticas, and it's not the same as a semi-structured interview. So plática, literally, platicar is literally to talk or to converse. And so they are those informal conversations that allow you to share ideas, to share knowledge, memories, consejos. And they're also a methodological intervention that a growing number of Chicanx, Latinx scholars have employed in their research. What happened years ago when I was at the University of Utah, after a series of literally kitchen table pláticas about Pláticas in research with graduate student advisees, we realized that there was a dearth of scholarship that really went into detail about Pláticas as a research method or methodology. And so Cindy Fierros, Dr. Cindy Fierros now, she was a graduate student at the time, we worked to actually articulate Pláticas, how students could put this in their methodology, but actually be able to name and cite and talk about the contours of it. She and I published an article in 2016 that tracks the genealogy of Pláticas from the late 1970s through the 1980s. And so what we found is in the 1970s and 80s, there had been Pláticas that were used, particularly, it was mostly found in early Hispanic research, mostly within the fields of psychology, of mental health, and social work. And these folks were using Pláticas as a result of researchers believing that traditional research methods like surveys and interviews didn't really work with Hispanic participants if the researcher didn't get to know the interviewees. But what was being used wasn't really a method or methodology, it was small talk before the interview or after the interview, but the real data came in the middle during the interview. And so within these more positive research perspectives, Pláticas were not viewed as valid data collection strategy and much less as an actual methodology. However, from a feminista perspective, Pláticas are theoretically and epistemologically congruent with how one sees the world and how one comes to know and understand. Francisca Gonzalez, that I mentioned earlier, her work from 1998, is often cited as one of the first scholars whose research on high school Mexicanas employed Pláticas from a Chicana feminist standpoint. She did not merely use Pláticas as a way into the lives of the youth in order to then collect data. Instead, the experiences and the stories that emerged, that they shared during the Pláticas, were viewed as the actual data, and most importantly, Pláticas as a space of theorization, So the Pláticas themselves were seen as a space of theorization where knowledge was shared and co-constructed with the young women. And that was very different than that kind of 1970s, 80s research where it was just to get to know folks. So based on Chicana Latina feminist scholarship, we reviewed, including a piece by Michelle Espino, Susana Munoz, and Judy Kiyama, Cindy and I proposed 5 principles that provide the contours of Plática methodology. And so we talk about it drawing from an anti-colonial feminist perspective. Most of what we found, scholars use that, but also paired with other critical theoretical frameworks. That it honors participants as co-constructors of knowledge, and that was very clear from Francisco Gonzalez's work to all the scholarship that we reviewed, that there was this co-construction of knowledge that was happening during the Plática. That this process connects everyday lived experiences to the research process. Those aren't separated. And that it provides a potential space of healing, not necessarily, but potential, and in healing, not the interviewee, but also the interviewer, that very often folks in their research talked about the healing process and being engaged in these kinds of informal dialogues. And finally, that it relies on reciprocity and vulnerability. That's really key to this idea of Pláticas, that as a researcher, you allow yourself to be vulnerable, and there's reciprocity. We're not going in to take from others. It's how is this going to be reciprocal? How can both benefit, I guess? One thing is that we really clearly say that these aren't a checklist of rules, like, well, if you do this, okay, that must be a plática, right? But we thought maybe if we could at least put principles that we found from the literature, folks that were using it, could guide scholars, particularly, as I said, in those pláticas at the kitchen table about pláticas, graduate students, early career scholars were really looking at, how do I defend this? How do I say this is different, and how do I name it? And so these were some of the contours that we came up. What's crucial in a Plática methodology is that relational component and how one interacts con respeto, with respect, reciprocity, and vulnerability with research participants. That's very closely aligned to what Ruth Trinidad Galvan talks about in terms of convivencia as methodology. Convivencia is literally cohabitation, living together, right? It is the literal translation, but it's much more than that. It's about living and being with one another, depending and working together, right? And so Trinidad Galvan understands convivencia as social relationships and practices that shed light on the ways Chicana Latinas draw from their cultural knowledge and experiences to live, learn, and teach together. Engaging convivencia in research means a deconstruction of power dynamics employed by the traditional researcher-subject dichotomy, and to acknowledge the mutual humanity of research participants. So in research, working within a space of convivencia means working together with communities in collective struggle for liberation. Also, the practice of convivencia allows us to build bridges between different socio-political locations, creating the opportunity for alliances and collective liberation. Convivencia as a methodology has to do with living together, forging relationships, creating union, and being aware of our mutual humanity in the research process. These are priorities that too often are ignored in methodological discussions or are devalued as too subject for the research process. I have some concluding comments, but again, because we don't have Q&A, another question I very often get I want to address, which is very often I will have males, Chicanos, Latinos, ask, or allies who aren't Chicanas, Latinas, can I use this? Can I do this? And I see everybody's head nodding, like, yeah, right? So was this talk just for the Chicanas, Latinas in the audience? It's definitely to them. But I guess what I would say, But I guess what I would say is we don't ask if just European Jewish folks can use Karl Marx, right? And at the same time, I do appreciate those questions, because what that tells me is the folks that are asking that question are really thinking about how women of color scholarship, black women, indigenous women scholarship has been appropriated and misappropriated. And so I would say that I'm thrilled when people ask that question, because it says they're thinking. I want folks to be reflexive, but I don't want this to just be some of the under the umbrella. So working from an epistemological orientation is about life and who you are and those kinds of experiences. But those theoretical tools that are offered, I think that people need to do their homework, really delve into this scholarship, or more generally the scholarship of women of color, not just cite bell hooks, not just cite Gloria Anzaldúa, but really, really do the work. And if it fits with what you're doing and the communities you're working with, then it can make sense. And so I think when I get asked that question, a lot of times people want me to be the, you know, I don't know, the testimonial police or the Pláticas police, like, yeah, just tell me, can I do it, can I not do it, right? And I'm not gonna do that, but I do think we know the history. As scholars of color, we know the history in terms of how our work has been misused and misappropriated, or our voices taken, or others who then try to lead in that body of scholarship. But I do think that there's a lot here for scholars to, again, coming back to reimagining, right? So I started with Anzaldúa. I'm going to end with Anzaldúa. I think of how feminist ideas and movements are attacked, called unnatural by the ruling powers, when in fact they are ideas whose time has come. Ideas as relentless as the waves carving and later eroding stone arches. Change is inevitable. No bridge lasts forever. Anzaldúa's words are an appropriate reminder of the relentless waves of ideas, of concepts, theories, and epistemological perspectives that indigenous women and women of color have offered us since the beginning of time, and feminist scholars have offered us for many, many decades. These intellectual contributions have eroded, not completely dismantled, but have eroded the heteropatriarchal narratives, normative systems of knowing, and restricted notions of who is a knowledge producer and what actually counts as knowledge. Some of those in academia continue to question the use of feminista methodologies, pedagogies, and epistemological perspectives, and I know that from those emails that I get regularly from early career scholars. Nevertheless, we must remember that as the scholarship has demonstrated, we have the will to reimagine the study of higher ed with innovative methodological interventions. In fact, I should mention the time has come. I like to think, I know there's a forthcoming article in AERJ by Nicole Garcia and Rebecca Mirales Rios, where they use Plática methodology to examine college choice processes. And so, again, the time has come as you all are reimagining how you do the work in higher ed. In the same way that Anzaldúa was called a theorist of hope, there is hope and possibilities when scholars such as these women and many others disrupt epistemological boundaries. As a graduate student, I recognize the wisdom of my elders and those whose shoulders I stood. Today, as a seasoned scholar activist, I'm inspired as I learn from and act upon the insights and the wisdom that's offered by current and future generation of scholar activists who provide the possibilities to reimagine how we do research. Thank you. Take a little drink.
My mind is full, my heart is full. Thank you so, so much. We have a small token to thank you, so you will never forget that you came to ASH as we were reimagining the study of higher education. When Leslie and I first thought of, when we were working with the program committee to think of a conference theme, and then as we began to think about who represented to us the people who have reimagined the study of education and pushed us further and let us see higher and things that had not existed, you came immediately to mind. We had this fantastic, many of you have heard, we work out of the same gym, this fantastic, super sweaty moment of like, oh, yes! So, little TMI, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful. I appreciate it. Thank you. Again, thanks for the invitation.
Oh, you're so welcome.